On the surface, the separation of what would become the church and the synagogue is a strange event. The one called Jesus by many today was a Jew called Yeshua by his family, friends, and enemies. The level of polarization over his self-identity, his teaching, and the proclamation of his followers is unmatched by any other historical figure. The faith of Yeshua the Messiah's earliest followers was born out of the intertestamental Judaisms of the first century of the Common Era. A generation after the reports of Yeshua's resurrection, Rabbinic Judaism would be birthed after the destruction of Jerusalem. The two sects came into being both in Israel. They shared salvation history. They shared the patriarchs. They shared the scripture. They shared morality. They shared a common cultural background which could and should have created an appreciation for each other. Compared to the brutal idolatry and paganism surrounding them, they had a great deal in common. Instead, much of history tells the story of two movements which have struggled with each other and competed against each other, even at times with malice. The rhetoric and posturing from both sides has suggested that these communities would happily contribute to the destruction of each other. How did this happen? Pinchas Lapid, a modern Orthodox Jew, answers, when one asks the basic question of what separates Jews and Christians from each other, the unavoidable answer is a Jew. For almost 2 millennia, a pious, devoted Jew has stood between us. A Jew who wanted to bring the kingdom of heaven in harmony, concord and peace, certainly not hatred, schism, let alone bloodshed. The schism between Rabbinic Judaism and belief in Yeshua is rooted in the early policy decisions of both the church and the synagogue. Historical distortions and unchallenged presuppositions have reinforced continuing distance between Jews and Christians over the generations. The increase in shalom and the reduction in fear or antagonism between these two communities is a worthy goal. This does not mean that they will magically come to an agreement on all issues, but the sharing of closely held doctrines and values, a re-examination of the historic record, and a toleration of opposing opinions could reduce hostility and contempt. Modern scholarship suggests that the traditional historic answers to these questions served to separate the synagogue and the church. Dr. Jeffrey Seif summarizes that conventional church history served the church and the synagogue equally well. The traditional wisdom has long argued that soon after inception, Christianity moved away from the Jewish people, happily shed its unneeded and unwanted Jewish baggage, and providentially morphed into the non-Jewish religion that we know it to be today, Christianity. This narrative would assume a lack of success in the spread of the good news among the Jews in Israel. This is at odds with the biblical record. The testimony of the book of Acts is that faith in Yeshua was very attractive to Jewish people in the first century CE. On hearing it, they praised God, but they also said to him, "You see, brothers, how many tens of thousands of believers there are among the Judeans, and they are all zealous for the Torah." The leadership of the growing church and the developing rabbinical community could have had an interest in the traditional narrative. They defined themselves in opposition to the community of competition with which they shared so much. Instead of developing a history of positive relationships, these two people competed for political influence at the other's expense. Distance was created between their respective communities, even to the point of reinventing the past, to create borders which had not previously existed. Leadership of both of these movements lived in the fear of the other, developed new doctrines as they competed, showed contempt for the other community, and grew further apart as time passed, losing almost all goodwill and common ground. There grew an agreement between the communities. Arkhendel Sulin recognizes this agreement when he says, "One was not allowed to be a Jew and a Christian at the same time. To be both was considered unnatural." What was Yeshua's original intention? The relationship of the Jews and those from the nations as a single flock. It's recorded in John chapter 10. Yeshua says, "I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I have known the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. And I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock and one shepherd." If our assumption is that the apostles were taught by Yeshua, and that they embodied his values, then the decisions made by the early body of Messiah are important in moving forward our understanding. This will be investigated. Did the descendants of the apostolic followers of Yeshua follow his path, or did they introduce dangerous innovations which would leave behind a trail of death? This 3-part video series is going to provide an introduction and an overview to the changing narrative led by modern scholars. Due to the broad nature of the subject, some may desire more depth in specific topics. These scholars in the discussions are named and credited so the interested can follow up on specific ideas and topics. Video 1, which you are currently watching, is going to investigate the split between the church and the synagogue. This was not pretty. Video 2 is going to provide an investigative overview of historic Jewish individuals who were interested in Yeshua and publicly declared faith in him, centered in the 19th century. Video 3 is going to review modern academic interest in Yeshua by Jewish scholars who are studying this topic, while not declaring faith in Yeshua in the traditional New Testament fashion. As should be expected, not all scholars agree on all points. Some might desire greater depth and nuance in treating their positions than a short video overview can provide. Some might desire to cross-examine other quoted scholars to further the dialogue. No referenced scholars should be understood as endorsing this video series in whole or part. This is simply an introduction to a fascinating topic. The modern development of Jewish-Christian relations seems to be moving back to the way it was in the beginning. Jewish and Christian academics investigating this history are coming to new conclusions. A new story is emerging. The split between the synagogue and the church was not a natural progression. Both communities surrendered aspects of their early belief systems in order to create distance from the other. It appears that there has been a significant Jewish interest in Yeshua, or Jesus, whenever it was not dangerous to investigate the topic. Jewish scholars will weigh in on topics some might think that there is no Jewish opinion on. Christian scholars will respond to unexpected innovation. These scholars who live on the borders between Christianity and Judaism will be included in the discussion. It may feel at times like a Thanksgiving dinner where an extended family gathers for a robust reunion. Everybody has strong opinions, but the point is not to silence part of the debate, but to hear each other out. Welcome to the journey. Prepare to be challenged. Come along for the ride. This is how it happened. How did the leaders of both communities create distance so early? You see, in the first century, Jews were a protected religion by the Romans. During 70 to 90 in the Common Era, Judaism wanted nothing to do with Yeshua. So who drew first blood? In the first century, the Jews did not need to sacrifice to the emperor. The Jewish people were given exemptions from certain activities. If the Jewish communities said that the Christians were not with them, this resulted in the Christians being turned over to the state and persecuted. There was no protection against the beast if the Christians were not under the wing of the Jewish world. When the Romans came for the Gentile Christians to force them into idolatry, was there a level of protection, or was it withheld? Anti-Semitism at this point in time would start to become a formal part of the Christian identity. Dr. Stuart Dowerman, in his treatment of the Church's loss of Yeshua's original identity, points out a curious lack in all of the original historic creeds. Yet no historic creed or confession of the Church makes any reference to Yeshua's Jewishness. Not one. The man from Galilee has become the Son of Man without a country. Dowerman then delivers Marcus Bockmuhl's understanding for why this happened. Marcus Bockmuhl notes that this substitution was intentional as a predominantly Gentile church sought to coalesce its self-definition and legitimacy through distancing itself from the founder's Jewish milieu. Certainly it was easier for Christians to imagine Christ forsaking the Jewish people and embracing the church as the new Israel when they forgot that he remains bone of Jewish bone and flesh of Jewish flesh. Dr. Jeffrey Seif mentions Ignatius of Antioch, Syria, as an early leader who sought to divide these communities. Ignatius is somewhat of an enigma. Ignatius showed his desire to move the early Christian church away from the fellowship or identification with the Jews. This is what he said. Be not seduced by strange doctrines or by antiquated fables, which are profitless. For even if to this day we live after the manner of Judaism, we avow that we have not received grace. If then those who walked in the ancient practices attained to the newness of hope, no longer observing Sabbaths, but fashioning their lives after the Lord's day, on which our life also arose through him and through his death, which some men deny, how shall we be able to live apart from him? It is monstrous to talk of Jesus Christ and to practice Judaism. For Christianity did not believe in Judaism, but Judaism in Christianity. How did this happen? In trying to understand how this became acceptable within 2 generations of the start of the Messianic faith in Yeshua, we seek the truth. Oscar Skarzheim writes, in Ignatius, the Jewish context of Christianity seems much more remote than in any other Christian writing. Any writing before him, or even immediately after him. What we observe in Ignatius may be best described as a loss of Jewish context. Ignatius's relationship to the Hebrew Scriptures is described and contrasted to the Jewish believers in Yeshua. This would have been significant and would have influenced his doctrine and his theology. It is described, one gets the impression in Ignatius's relationship with the Old Testament that it was mainly a literary one. For him, the Old Testament was a book, not a living past, which through traditions and observances determined his own life and thinking. It is this, more than anything else, that betrays the Gentile Christian. The position of Ignatius may be best characterized as New Testament orthodoxy. It was the apostolic writings that made him value the Old Testament and love the prophets. The authority of the Old Testament is undisputed, but it is derived from the authority of the gospel. This is contrasted with the organic way in which the Jewish believers in Yeshua related to the Hebrew Scriptures. That was probably the most characteristic difference between Jewish believers and believers coming from an entirely Gentile background. It was not a question of doctrinal difference, but rather a difference of mentality. For both groups, the Old Testament was an authoritative book, and the Church of the Gentiles was later to defend the Old Testament bravely and at considerable cost to them from attacks from within the church and attacks from without. But to them the Old Testament was and would remain a book, describing a history that was past and was finished. To the Jewish believer it was so much more. Through innumerable cords of traditions, festivals, daily practices, religious concepts, etc., the Jewish believers were bound up with the Old Testament. It was part of their lives. Unfortunately, once the seed of anti-Semitism was planted, it would continue to grow. The significant hardening of anti-Jewish sentiment happened around the time of the Council of Nicaea. Let me read to you what Dr. Louis Goldberg wrote about this. While the struggle between Gentile believers in Yeshua and the Jewish people in general began in small measure even during the 200s, probably the first instance of real stiffening began with the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. The council was attended by 318 bishops, and its main directive concerned the person of the Messiah. This was necessary, for there could be no heresy in this respect. However, another decision was made at the same council. The celebration of Easter was to be separated from the Jewish Passover. This action was particularly grievous because there was no Jewish representation, even though there were at least 18 Jewish bishops in the land of Israel. Their absence left a free hand to the bishops who could establish norms on certain subjects without meeting any opposition. Baghdadi further emphasized that once the way was open, future councils followed the same track, ever widening the division among Christians, i.e. between Jewish and Gentile believers in Jesus. In case some might think this was merely an oversight, the church historian Eusebius preserved Constantine's letter sent out by courier at the end of the Council of Nicaea. This makes the motivation for the act of divorcing Easter from Passover very clear. Let me read to you what Constantine wrote and what Eusebius recorded. It was declared to be particularly unworthy for this, the holiest of all festivals, to follow the custom and the calculation of the Jews, who had soiled their hands with the most fearful of crimes, and whose minds were blinded. In rejecting their custom, we may transmit to our descendants the legitimate mode of celebrating Easter, which we have observed from the time of the Savior, passion to the present day according to the day of the week. We ought not therefore to have anything in common with the Jews, for the Savior has shown us another way. Our worship follows a more legitimate and a more convenient course, the order of the days of the week, and consequently in unanimously adopting this mode, we desire, dearest brethren, to separate ourselves from the detestable company of the Jews, for it is truly shameful for us to hear them boast that without their direction they could not keep this feast. How then could we follow these Jews, who are most certainly blinded by error? But even if this were not so, it would still be your duty not to tarnish your soul by communication with such wicked people, the Jews. John Chrysostom served as a bishop in Antioch, Syria at the end of the 4th century, before moving on to become the archbishop in Constantinople. He traveled the same path as Ignatius had 200 years earlier. Chrysostom would continue to pursue the downward trend in Jewish relations which had been set in motion by Ignatius, by Nicaea, and by church tradition. The following quote reveals a continuation of hatred and contempt for Jewish customs, traditions, and any people who would uphold them. Chrysostom, Archbishop of Constantinople, said, "The synagogue is worse than a brothel. It is the den of scoundrels and the repair of wild beasts, the temple of demons devoted to idolatrous cults, the refuge of brigands and debaucheries, the caverns of devils. It is a criminal assembly of Jews, a place of meeting for the assassins of Christ, a house worse than a drinking shop, a den of thieves, a house of ill fame, a dwelling of iniquity, the refuge of devils, a gulf and abyss of perdition. As for me, I hate the synagogue. I hate the Jews for the same reason." Were these really following Yeshua's example? Is this the biblical New Covenant model? Some have actually suggested that Ignatius and Chrysostom were merely following Shaul, the Apostle Paul, in his treatment of the Jews. And if there was a hatred of the Jews in Christian tradition, it originated in the New Covenant. You know, sometimes there's an in-house dispute. And sometimes in an in-house dispute, a family uses language which would never be acceptable under any other circumstances. Many Christian commentators miss that Yeshua, the apostles, and Shaul all were Jews. They operated inside the Jewish community, and Shaul refers to himself as a Pharisee decades after he had been called to preach Yeshua. Yeshua, the apostles, and Shaul all had significantly positive things to say about Jews, and they continued to identify as Jews. There is the balance of the loving positive along with the Hebraic prophetic call to their own people that was evidenced by Yeshua, Shaul, and the apostolic writings, which is missed by those who wrench passages out of context. There does not seem to be this love or identification with the Jewish people shown by Ignatius and Chrysostom, with neither explicitly writing positively about the Jewish people. New Covenant doctrinal disagreements would not become demonization of a people group, but this sadly became the post-apostolic standard. To understand the proper early relationship between Yeshua-believing Jews and Gentiles, what should have happened in the post-apostolic era, the apostolic New Covenant determination would have had to have been followed. In the 1st century CE, this was the theological version of the Wild West. The intended relationship between Jews and Gentiles was prayerfully considered in Jerusalem by the apostles. Early success in proclaiming Yeshua to Gentile God-fearers attached to the synagogue started to swell the ranks of Gentile believers in Yeshua. How were they to relate to each other? This deliberation and process was recorded in Acts chapter 15. Some Jewish enthusiasts had taken it upon themselves to proclaim outside of Israel, "Unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved." This caused a conflict which could only be resolved by the top authorities in Jerusalem. Dr. Dan Juster points out that the assumption of the body of Messiah in the 1st century was that Jewish believers in Yeshua would continue to live and identify as Jews. Juster writes, "All of church history testifies that the Jewish believers maintained their heritage. This was so obviously accepted by all the apostles that it was never addressed as an issue until after their death. Scholars today are beginning to perceive that the apostolic position was that Jews should maintain their biblical calling and heritage. The experience and the testimony of Shaul, Barnabas, and Shimon Kepha pointed to an unexpected way that the Ruach HaKodesh was working in providing freedom for the Gentiles to accept Yeshua as they were. James, known as Jacob, the brother of Yeshua, carefully weighed in on this testimony and opposed the original position which was proposed for Gentile conversion to a Jewish religious identity, saying that this was mandatory for salvation. After appealing to a composite quote from the Hebrew Scriptures, he continued, saying, "Therefore my judgment is that we should not trouble those of the Gentiles who turn to God, but we should write to them to abstain from things polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, and from what has been strangled, and from blood. For from ancient generations Moses has in every city those who proclaim him, for he is read every Shabbat in the synagogues." The apostolic ruling from Jerusalem assumed that both Jewish believers in Yeshua and Gentile believers would continue to attend synagogue together. This ruling seemed to have been a minimum standard for new believers in Yeshua. This was a standard for righteous Gentiles known in the Jewish world as the Noahide rules, going back to Noah, who built the ark to save animals and his family's life in Genesis. As a result of this decision, there could not have been any legitimate opposition to Jewish believers in Yeshua continuing to live and identify as Jews. Nor could there have been legitimate opposition to Gentile believers in Yeshua observing Jewish customs as long as they did not proudly maintain it was necessary for salvation or claim spiritual superiority for those who chose to follow these biblical customs over other believers in Yeshua. Full freedom was granted for those who believed in Yeshua and chose to integrate different customs from their cultural origins. So Jeff Seif asserts that Ignatius and John Chrysostom, two church fathers who were well known for their anti-Jewish positions, were in fact in competition with the Jewish believers in Yeshua of their generation. The vibrancy of the Messianic Jewish movement in Ignatius's time would be expected, since it was so close to the apostolic time period and close to Israel. But scholars have often assumed that Chrysostom opposed the rabbinic Jewish community, since it was assumed that in the second half of the 4th century after Nicaea, there would not have seen a dynamic Messianic Jewish community which could compete head-on with the church regarding the practices and the hearts of believers in Yeshua. Ken Howard, reviewing the early church's relationship to Jewish believers in Yeshua, found heresy in some quarters, but ultimately came to the conclusion, in that compromise, the Jewish Christian church in Jerusalem agreed to respect Paul's law-free mission to the Gentiles. Similarly, Paul and the Gentile churches agreed to respect the light of the Jewish Christian churches to practice the ceremonial law. The Nazarenes were the descendants of the Jewish Christian church of Jerusalem. They considered themselves a part of the greater church. They respected apostolic authority. They acknowledged the authority of Paul, his letters, and law-free Gentile mission. Yet they reserved to themselves the right to practice the ceremonial law, not for purposes of salvation, but to be imitators of their Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. It can clearly be argued that while the Nazarene Jewish Christians yet honored the decree, it was broken by the larger church. The history reviewed in this video suggests that the practices of Yeshua and his apostles would become outlawed among those who claimed to follow him. Shabbat, biblical feasts, Jewish cultural practice, all developed into forbidden practices. Scarzone postulates the possibility that Irenaeus misunderstood Galatians 3:19-29 as prohibiting Jewish believers from continued practice of the law. Could there have been other misunderstandings which drove in numerous wedges between these people? Oscar Skarzheim clearly condenses Daniel Boyarin's warning not to read greater order, theological development, and community separation into the earlier histories, which would take centuries for Christian bishops and the rabbis to enforce. Skarzheim writes, with regard to this procedure, Boyarin argues that if we adopt the definitions of Judaism and Christianity offered us in the sources, we adopt the normative definitions launched by the religious leaders on both sides, who by these definitions tried to create borders where none existed. According to Boyarin, the great pioneer on the Christian side in this game of making clear borders was Justin, and on the Jewish side, the late 2nd century sages of the Mishnah, roughly contemporaries of Justin. E. Lee Gibson starts the essay on the Jews and Christians in the Martyrdom of Polycarp with this quote. As Lawrence Broadhurst reminded us in a review of Daniel Boyarin's Dying for God, the idea of an indistinct border between Judaism and Christianity for several centuries is not entirely novel, but Boyarin's pursuit of it is. Daniel Boyarin makes the point that Orthodox Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism both had a significant hand in the shaping of their competitors' boundaries. In his writing, he addressed this in both Borderlines and A Radical Jew. A sample from Dr. Boyarin's introduction to A Radical Jew, his study of Paul the Apostle, is, in addition to Paul's activity and its consequences have been an enormous effect on the history of the Jews and Judaism in late antiquity, not to mention afterward. Much of that distinctive religious formation that we call Rabbinic Judaism, which is the ancestor of virtually all Judaisms since late antiquity, was formed in the environment of a Pauline Christianity, growing steadily in influence through the crucial formative centuries of this Judaism and culminating in the triumph of Christianity in the 4th century. Skarzheim continues with his condensation of Boyarin's thought to conclude. One has to add that neither Justin nor the sages were able to have their border making immediately recognized by each and every Jew or Christian, so that we have to look to the 4th century and to the Constantinian epoch as the time when this border making was effective on the ground. While there was significant energy by the heads of their respective religious communities to keep a separation between Jews and Christians, Skarzheim reviews the physical evidence of the early centuries. The view that Jews and Christians were socially close and had much contact with each other in the diaspora is strongly supported by archaeology. A close and surprisingly peaceful coexistence between Jews and Christians is the rule rather than the exception as far as the archaeological record is concerned. Fredrickson examines the evidence between the ancient religious communities, finding it leads to the same conclusion. She says, when did the ways part? Our answer, and indeed the question itself, depends on the evidence we consider. Precisely this evidence points in the other direction. On the ground, the ways were not separating. Certainly not fast enough and consistently enough to please the ideologues. While Christianity sought to shed its Jewish origins through outlawing the apostolic culture, what was the rabbinic world doing? It is important to understand that the later, more uniform Judaism simply did not exist at the time under study. Dr. Daniel Boyarin outlines a more complex pre-rabbinic 1st century Judaism compared to many 1st century CE readings, as it was developing in Yeshua and Shaul's era. Much which would later be recognized as Jewish or Christian would all be part of a common mix. The almost chaotic diversity of thought outlined by Boyarin was significantly different from the myth of a more orderly development of doctrine which would later become standard. So being religiously Jewish then was a much more complicated affair than it is even now. There were no rabbis yet, and even the priests in Jerusalem and around the countryside were divided amongst themselves. Not only that, but there were many Jews in both Palestine and outside of it, in such places as Alexandria in Egypt, who had very different ideas about what being a good, devout Jew meant. Some believed that in order to be a kosher Jew, you had to believe in a single divine figure, and any other belief was simply idol worship. Others believed that God had a divine deputy, or emissary, or even son, exalted above all angels, who functioned as an intermediary between God and the world in creation, revelation, and redemption. And this one was going to be affected by a human being, an actual scion of the house of David, an Anastasia, who at a certain point would take up the scepter and the sword, defeat Israel's enemies, and return her to her former glory. Others believed that the redemption was going to be affected by that same second divine figure mentioned above, and not a human being at all. And still others believed that these two were one and the same, that the Messiah of David would be the divine Redeemer. As I said, a complicated affair. The complexity that Daniel Boyarin recognizes as being part of the Jewish world during the same time that the Christian doctrine was developing would end up becoming less and less permitted. As the bishops had more control over the Christian world, so too the rabbis would demonstrate more control over the Jewish world. And toleration of plurality would end up not being accepted. Various other doctrines that had been terribly Jewish to believe would not be as accepted. The sense that one was not allowed to be both Jewish and Christian at the same time would turn out to be a borderland which was far more populated than the gatekeepers desired. Instead of a depopulated natural boundary between the Jewish and the Christian religious communities, the no man's land that is described was densely populated with all kinds of life and all kinds of activity. Videos 2 and videos 3 are going to explore more recent border dwellers in the land between Judaism and Christianity. Franz Delitzsch, a German biblical scholar of the 19th century who was a great supporter of sharing Yeshua with the Jewish people, wrote with the benefit of historical hindsight. The attitude of the church to the Jews was almost willfully aimed to strengthen them in their antipathy to Christianity. The church still owes the Jews the actual proof of Christianity's truth. Is it surprising that the Jewish people are such an insensitive and barren field for the gospel? The church itself has drenched it in blood and heaped stones upon it. As I've been sharing this evening, one of the young men in my community has been listening to this and monitoring it, and his question was, so what are you tying all together? And I guess in the midst of this, what I am tying all together is this, that there was no reason and there was no purpose, and it was not God's intention from the very beginning that the Jews and that those who believed in Yeshua would be hostile to each other. It was never God's intention that there would be an animosity or an antagonism. It was God's intention that his people, Jewish and those of the nations who found Yeshua, would end up seeing themselves as part of a flock. I really believe that what we have discovered and what we have found is that for reasons that served the shepherds, hatred was created where it was never intended to be found. And I really believe that even as those who led spiritual communities tried to create hatred and tried to create division, that in many cases, the Jewish people and those of the nations who embraced Yeshua continued to find common ground with each other. And I really believe that in the next two videos, there is going to be proof of Jewish interest in Yeshua and of these two communities coming closer and closer together. The bigotry that has been recorded in this video is breathtaking. Ignatius, the scholars around Constantine, Chrysostom, these were not foolish men. These were not unread men. These were not men who were unfamiliar with Yeshua's teaching. To think that these men could know Yeshua's teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, on discipleship, and on internal discipline of the heart being what it was to follow Yeshua, and not just simply externally conforming to a religious standard being what Yeshua called people to, that they could know this and that they could continue to preach and teach and politic for the views that they did, is truly breathtaking. They published what they had to say, and it was preserved across the generations. It influenced not only their generation, but it influenced many generations that came after them. How many Jewish people have been turned away from considering Yeshua due to the public hatred of these church leaders? It was certainly more than a single child. How could they miss the application of Yeshua's teaching when he said, "And whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, it would be better for him to have a heavy millstone hung around his neck and to be drowned in the depth of the sea. Woe to the world because of its stumbling blocks, for it is inevitable that stumbling blocks come, but woe to the man through whom the stumbling blocks come." The hostility to the Jewish people would be cemented in by further church councils after Nicaea by Augustine and become normative in the church. As evidence of this continued hostility, Bernard of Clairvaux, who was famous for a treatise on the love of God and built the Cistercian order, he protected the Jews from mass murder, but his opinion of the Jews he protected was hardly positive. He charged the whole Jewish people with a stupidity, bestial and more bestial, an intelligence coarse and dense, as if it were bovine, because they did not follow the Lord. They were an evil seed. There was nothing in them that was not crude and coarse. Whether we consider their occupations, their inclinations, their understanding, or even their rites with which they worship God. Martin Luther's bitter comments on the Jews from the end of his life are now better known, since the Third Reich used them to promote genocide during the Shoah, or the Holocaust. First, their synagogues should be set on fire. Secondly, their homes should likewise be broken down and destroyed. Thirdly, they should be deprived of their prayer books and Talmuds. Fourthly, their rabbis must be forbidden under threat of death to teach anymore. Fifthly, passport and traveling privileges should absolutely be forbidden to the Jews. Sixthly, they ought to be stopped from usury. Seventhly, let the young and the strong Jew and Jewesses be given the flail, the axe, the hoe, the spade, the distaff, and the spindle, and let them earn their bread by the sweat of their noses. We ought to drive the rascally lazy bones out of our systems. Therefore, away with them. To sum it up, dear princes and nobles who have Jews in your dominions, if this advice of mine does not suit you, then find a better one, so that you and we may be all free of this insufferable, devilish burden, the Jews.